You are worthless now. This house will be ours.
You are worthless now. This house will be ours. Those were the chilling words Eleanor heard from her own blood. From that moment, a battle began, where truth and betrayal cut deep like a blade. If you think this is just another family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now to never miss our most gripping films. The house stood taller than it had in years. Its weathered shutters were replaced, its walls repainted in a soft ivory that caught the afternoon sun. The porch creaked less now, not because time had been erased, but because care had been restored. Spanish moss still draped the oaks, swaying gently as if blessing the transformation. But it was no longer just Eleanor's house. It was something more. A plaque gleamed by the front gate, the Eleanor White Cultural Center. Inside, the air no longer smelled of dust and fear. It smelled of polish, books, fresh paint, and life. The parlor had been converted into a reading room, lined with shelves of Robert's old volumes, history, philosophy, memoirs, each spine carefully preserved. Upstairs, the bedrooms had been transformed into art studios, classrooms, spaces for workshops. The dining room, where Eleanor once taped evidence to the walls, was now a gallery of photographs. Savannah's people, their struggles, their triumphs. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her hand brushing against the smooth wood of the banister, her heart full. For decades, the house had been a symbol of what she had lost, of what she could not claim. Now, it was a beacon of what she had given back. Volunteers bustled around her neighbors, students, even strangers who had been moved by her story. They painted, carried in boxes, arranged chairs. The house was alive again, not as a fortress, but as a gathering place. Marjorie appeared beside her, handing her a cup of tea. "You did it, Eleanor. You gave this house a new soul." Eleanor smiled softly. "No, we did it." Her voice cracked with gratitude. "Robert wanted this legacy. I just made sure it was born." The day of the scholarship fund's opening was bright and full of voices. Children spilled into the cultural center's yard, their laughter echoing off the old bricks. A banner stretched across the porch. The Eleanor White Scholarship Fund. Opening ceremony. Eleanor stood on the porch, her hands trembling slightly as she held the microphone. Her gaze swept over the sea of faces, young students with notebooks clutched to their chests, parents wiping tears, elders standing proudly in the back. Her voice was soft at first, then steadier with each word. "When my husband died, I thought my story was over. I thought I had nothing left to give. But I was wrong. What we build together doesn't die with us. It grows if we choose to protect it." The crowd was silent, listening, leaning into every syllable. Eleanor took a breath. "This fund, this house, this center, it isn't about me. It's about you, about every child who dreams, about every family who refuses to be erased, about every soul in Savannah who deserves to see that their history matters." Applause erupted, long and thunderous. The children swarmed her afterward, hugging her legs, pressing thank you cards into her hands. One little girl looked up at her with wide, earnest eyes. "Miss Eleanor, I want to be a teacher one day, and now, maybe I can." Eleanor knelt down, tears streaming freely. She cupped the girl's cheek, her voice breaking. "You can be anything, sweetheart. Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise." For the first time, Eleanor didn't feel like the last branch of a broken tree. She felt like roots, deep, unshakable, nourishing what was to come. The months that followed were filled with activity. The Cultural Center hosted poetry readings, history lectures, music recitals. The Scholarship Fund began awarding its first recipients, students whose names Eleanor learned by heart, whose stories she carried like jewels. But in the quieter moments, she reflected. Standing in the garden one evening, she watched neighbors planting flowers around the walkway, their laughter mingling with the smell of earth. Children chalked the sidewalks with bright colors. Music drifted from an open window. It was then she realized her family wasn't defined by blood. Her family was here in the people who had chosen to stand by her, fight with her, rebuild with her. The loneliness that had once haunted her was gone. Where there had been silence, now there was song. Where there had been shadows, now there was light. A reporter once asked her, "Do you ever regret what happened?" The betrayal? The pain? Eleanor had smiled gently, shaking her head. Regret? Number pain shapes us. Betrayal teaches us. But love redeems us. I found my true family in my community. I am no longer alone. Her words spread, quoted in newspapers, posted online, inspiring others far beyond Savannah. She had become a symbol not of wealth or power, but of resilience, of justice, of rebirth. The final scene of her story was quiet. The sun dipped low, casting the city in golden hues. Eleanor sat by the window of the upstairs study, the same window where she once stared out in despair after signing away her home. Now, the light poured in like blessing. Dust motes danced in the glow, floating like tiny spirits. Eleanor sat with a book open in her lap, her glasses perched low, her face softened by peace. Her gaze wandered beyond the words to the children playing outside, their laughter drifting up like music. She smiled, her eyes glistening, her chest rising with a breath that felt lighter than any she had taken in years. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "We are never truly alone, not when we choose to belong." The camera lingered on her face, wrinkled, scarred by life, but radiant with quiet triumph. And as the light of the setting sun bathed her in gold, Eleanor White, widow, grandmother, fighter, founder, sat not in sorrow but in serenity. Her story was no longer one of loss, it was one of renewal, a legacy reborn. The night of the confrontation bled into morning, but the fire it sparked had not dimmed. Eleanor sat in Marcus's office once again, her forehead bandaged, her body sore, but her spirit sharper than ever. Around her, the walls were stacked with folders, USB drives, and the scattered pages they had gathered. Marcus leaned over the desk, his voice low but steady. "It's time," he said. He gathered the evidence into a single thick file, clasped it shut, and slid it across the table. Eleanor stared at it, her wrinkled hands resting gently on the cover. Inside was everything: Robert's original will, the forged deeds, Daniel's contract, Samuel's whistleblower memos, the recording from the hotel. Proof not only of betrayal, but of a machine designed to strip Savannah bare. "Are you ready?" Marcus asked. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. "Let's end this." At the precinct, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Marcus placed the file into the hands of Detective Harris, a stern woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for cutting through lies. She flipped through the documents, her brow furrowing, her lips tightening. "This," she said, holding up the forged deed, "is felony fraud. And this contract with Southern Horizons, it's racketeering." She turned her gaze on Eleanor, softer now. "Ma'am, you've done more investigative work than half my department." Eleanor's chest swelled, not with pride, but with relief. She had been afraid no one would listen, that she'd be dismissed as fragile, irrelevant. But here, at last, the truth was being heard. Detective Harris closed the file with a decisive snap. "We'll open the case immediately. Your grandson, the developers, they won't walk away from this." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. For the first time in months, she felt the heavy weight on her chest begin to lift. The arrest came at dawn. Police cars rolled quietly into Daniel's pristine neighborhood, their lights flashing against manicured lawns and white-columned porches. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as officers pounded on his door. Inside, Daniel stumbled into the entryway, his shirt half-buttoned, his hair unkempt. "What the hell is this?" he barked as two officers stepped forward. "Daniel Reed White," Detective Harris announced, "you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse." His face twisted in disbelief. "You can't be serious. This is a mistake. I'm the victim here." But the cuffs snapped cold around his wrists. He struggled, his voice rising, desperate. "You don't know what you're doing. This is my future, my city." As they dragged him out onto the porch, his eyes found Eleanor, standing at the edge of the sidewalk with Marcus at her side. For a fleeting moment, grandson and grandmother locked eyes. His were filled with venom, his jaw clenched with rage. Hers were brimming with sorrow and strength all at once. "You did this to me," he spat. Eleanor's voice was quiet, but it cut like glass. "No, Daniel, you did this to yourself." He turned away, shoved into the back of the squad car. The door slammed shut, and the sound echoed down the street like the closing of a chapter. The dominoes fell quickly after that. With Daniel in custody, investigators raided Southern Horizon's downtown offices. Boxes of files were carried out, hard drives seized. The headlines exploded across newspapers and television screens. Savannah widow exposes multi-million-dollar real estate fraud. Developers accused of targeting elderly homeowners. Historic district saved by whistleblower evidence. News anchors repeated her name with reverence. Eleanor White. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed. Microphones thrust forward. "Mrs. White, how did you uncover the scheme? What do you say to other seniors facing exploitation?" Eleanor answered with trembling honesty. "They wanted me to disappear. They wanted my home, my history, my dignity. But I realized when they silence one of us, they threaten all of us. I couldn't stay quiet. None of us can." Across Savannah, the mood shifted. People who had felt powerless saw a 72-year-old widow stand against wealth and influence and win. Communities began to rally, demanding protections, filing lawsuits of their own, calling out corruption. Southern Horizon's executives were indicted on charges of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. One by one, the empire cracked, its glossy facade stripped bare to reveal rot underneath. And in the middle of it all stood Eleanor, not as a victim, but as the spark that lit the fire. The night of the verdict, neighbors filled Eleanor's home. The broken window had been repaired, the walls still lined with papers that told the story of their fight. Food covered the table, laughter echoed against the walls. But when the news came across the television, Daniel formally charged Southern Horizon's executives facing trial. Eleanor couldn't hold back. She sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands, and wept. Not the tears of despair that had haunted her since Robert's death, not the tears of betrayal when Daniel shoved papers across her table. These were tears of release, of victory, of belonging. Strong arms wrapped around her, Marjorie, Harold, Samuel, the students who had rallied behind her. The community held her close, their warmth pressing against her from every side. "You're not alone anymore," someone whispered. Eleanor lifted her head, her eyes wet but shining. She looked around at the faces, at the neighbors who had once doubted but now stood firm, and for the first time since Robert's passing, she felt whole. The city was still scarred, the fight not fully over, but tonight, justice had spoken. And Eleanor White, trembling in the embrace of her community, knew she had not only saved her home, she had saved the soul of Savannah. The banners were everywhere, glossy posters stretched across the community center walls, dripping with promises: a new Savannah, modern living for a modern future, progress you deserve. The crowd filled every seat, the air charged with restless energy. Some came out of curiosity, others out of fear, many because they felt they had no choice. Developers had money, lawyers, influence. What did a widow or a handful of neighbors have against that? On stage, the executives from Southern Horizon stood polished and rehearsed, their suits gleaming under fluorescent lights. They clicked through slides of gleaming skyscrapers, shopping centers, luxury condos towering where old oak trees once stood. The crowd murmured, dazzled by the spectacle. One of the executives raised his voice with practiced ease. "This city deserves better than crumbling houses and outdated streets. We're bringing jobs, infrastructure, investment. This is the future of Savannah." Applause broke out from a few voices near the front planted, Eleanor suspected. Others in the audience shifted uneasily, their doubt dulled by the presentation's sheer force. The developers were winning, their polished words sinking into ears desperate for reassurance. Daniel sat among them, his posture confident, his eyes sweeping the room like a conqueror surveying his prize. He leaned toward a woman beside him, whispering, smirking. To him, it was already done. But then the doors opened. A hush fell as Eleanor stepped inside. She walked slowly but with purpose. Marcus beside her, a leather folder clutched tightly in his hand. The whispers began immediately. "Isn't that Robert White's widow? What's she doing here?" All eyes followed her as she made her way to the front. Her hands trembled slightly, but her spine was straight, her gaze unflinching. For weeks she had been dismissed as fragile, irrelevant. Now she stood in the heart of the battle. Eleanor's voice, though small at first, cut through the murmurs. "You've heard their future. Now you'll hear the truth." Marcus opened the folder, his deep voice steady. "This is the original will of Robert White, notarized, witnessed, legal. It grants his estate and assets to Eleanor White, not to Daniel, not to Southern Horizons. What you have seen so far has been built on fraud." Gasps rippled through the crowd. He held up another document, the forged deed with Daniel's signature. "This is what they used to steal her house. This is criminal forgery." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice breaking but strong. "They told me I didn't matter. They told me to step aside. But this, she, raised the contract with Daniel's name, proves what they are. Thieves, liars, predators. And if they can do this to me, they can do it to all of you." The tension snapped taut. The executives shifted uncomfortably. The crowd leaned forward, whispers swelling into outrage. Daniel's jaw tightened. His confident mask began to crack. Then it happened. In a flash of movement, Daniel shot from his seat. His footsteps thundered against the floor as he charged the stage. "Stop her!" he shouted, his voice breaking. Before Marcus could react, Daniel lunged for the folder. Papers scattered across the stage like feathers. Eleanor's cry pierced the air as he shoved her backward, her frail body collapsing against the podium. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that shook the room. For a moment, time froze. The widow sprawled on the floor, her grandson standing above her, fists clenched, eyes wild. Eleanor's hands gripped the podium as she tried to rise. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead where she had struck the corner. But her voice, though ragged, rang out. "This house, this city, is not for sale." Her words split the silence like thunder, and then the emotion in the room erupted. Shouts filled the hall. "Enough! She's right! How dare you lay hands on her!" People surged from their seats, rushing toward the stage. A group of neighbors formed a protective circle around Eleanor, helping her to her feet, shielding her from Daniel's rage. Marcus gathered the scattered papers, holding them high above the chaos. The developers shouted for order, but their polished words had lost their power. The spell was broken. In the crowd, anger boiled over decades of frustration, igniting in a single moment. They weren't just defending Eleanor, they were defending themselves, their homes, their history. Daniel tried to shout over them, but his voice was drowned in the roar of the people. His power slipped through his fingers like water. Eleanor, trembling, pressed a hand against her wound, her eyes burning with tears and fire. She looked out at the sea of faces rising for her, for themselves, and knew the truth. She was no longer fighting alone. The battle had left the shadows. It was now in the open, blazing in the hearts of everyone in that room. And Savannah would never be the same. The brick still lay on her mantle, a grim reminder of the night when glass shattered and fear crept in. But fear had not stopped her, it had hardened into resolve. And now, sitting across from Marcus in his cluttered office, Eleanor leaned forward, her voice steadier than he had ever heard. "Show me everything," she said. Marcus hesitated for only a breath, then pulled a thick stack of folders from his filing cabinet. Dust rose into the air as he dropped them onto the desk. "Robert suspected something like this," he said. "He started keeping copies, contracts, communications, anything that smelled wrong, but he never lived long enough to see how deep it went." Together, they dug. Page after page, Eleanor traced the lines of fine print with her finger. Her eyes narrowed as she read clauses about property acquisition, transfer of rights, strategic redevelopment. Then, buried in the stack, she found it. A contract dated only weeks before Robert's death. At the bottom, in Daniel's sharp, impatient signature, were the words, "Consultant Agreement with Southern Horizons Development." Her chest tightened. He was already in bed with them, even before Robert passed. Marcus nodded grimly. "This proves collusion. He wasn't just manipulated, he was their partner." Eleanor's hands shook, but she held the contract high, staring at the ink as if it might burn through the page. The boy she had rocked to sleep, the boy whose hand she had held at his mother's grave, had sold her out long before the first smile and the first insurance papers. Something inside her broke, but what replaced it was sharper, colder. "We'll use this," she whispered. "We'll use all of it." That night, Eleanor transformed her dining room into a war room. The table was no longer a place for meals, but for evidence. She taped documents to the walls, her old hands slow but deliberate. Bank transfers on one side, deeds on another, the forged signature circled in red. Daniel's contract pinned at the center like the rotten heart of it all. Her breath came heavy as she stepped back, studying the collage. It looked like something out of a detective's office, threads of history tied together, secrets exposed. She stood in the middle of it, her frail body dwarfed by the sheer weight of the evidence. But in her eyes, there was no frailty, only fire. She picked up a marker and scrawled across the top of the wall in shaky but determined letters, "The truth." And then, like an investigator building her case, she began to connect the dots. This payment, she murmured to herself, tapping one paper, led to this acquisition, which links to this development plan, which ties back to Daniel's contract. Her voice was steady, her rhythm relentless. Piece by piece, the puzzle revealed itself. For the first time in her 72 years, Eleanor White wasn't just surviving history, she was writing it. The knock came just past midnight, a cautious, hurried tapping on her door. Eleanor froze, her body tense. For a moment, fear surged, another brick, another threat. But when she opened the door, a young man stood in the rain, his clothes damp, his eyes darting nervously. "Mrs. White?" he whispered. She nodded slowly. "My name's Samuel. I used to work for Southern Horizons." His voice trembled. "I can't stay long, but I know what they're doing to you, to all of us." Eleanor stepped aside, ushering him in. He glanced around at the walls covered in evidence, his eyes widening. "You already know more than most." "Tell me," Eleanor urged, her voice low, urgent. Samuel swallowed hard. "They've been falsifying valuations, telling homeowners their properties are worth half of what they are. Then they intimidate them, letters, threats, sometimes worse. Once they force the sale, they funnel money through shell companies. Daniel, your grandson, he was their inside man. He gave them access to financial records, family connections. He made the betrayal look legitimate." Eleanor's heart clenched, but she held his gaze. "Can you prove it?" He nodded, pulling a flash drive from his pocket. His hand shook as he pressed it into hers. "Emails, contracts, internal memos, enough to bury them. But," he glanced at the window, his voice dropping, "they'll come after me if they know I talked." Her hand closed over his, her grip firm. "They won't. I'll protect you. We all will." For the first time, Samuel's shoulders eased. He gave a small nod, then slipped back into the rain. Eleanor stared at the flash drive glowing faintly in her palm. Proof, real proof. By morning, she stood again in her war room. The flash drive's contents spilled across her screen, emails dripping with arrogance, contracts stamped with fraud, memos that reduced entire neighborhoods to numbers and profit margins. Her breath trembled, but her eyes were sharp. She had what she needed, yet outside, the shadows pressed closer. She could feel them watching, waiting. The brick had been only the beginning. Now she carried evidence that could ruin them all. Danger was near. She could almost hear it breathing at her door. Her hand hovered over Robert's photograph, her voice steady in the silence. "I won't stop. Not now." The old widow who had once signed papers out of trust was gone. In her place stood a woman armed with the truth and ready to fight with it. The war had entered a new phase, and Eleanor White, trembling but unbroken, was at its center. The storm had been building since the meeting in the church basement. Eleanor could feel it in her bones, an energy in the air, restless, electric. Word had spread quickly across Savannah's old quarter. The widow who had been cast aside by her own grandson was fighting back. Some whispered admiration, others whispered fear. But the whispers reached Daniel. He arrived unannounced. His car roared into the driveway, headlights cutting through the dusk like blades. Eleanor was in the kitchen when she heard the slam of the door, the sharp rhythm of his shoes across the hardwood floor. "Grandma!" His voice was sharp, no longer coated in honey, no longer pretending. She stepped into the living room, her frame small but steady. He stood there in his tailored suit, his eyes wild with anger, his jaw clenched tight. "I heard you've been running your mouth," he snapped. "You went to Marcus. You've been talking to the neighbors. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Eleanor held her ground, her hands clasped in front of her. "I've told the truth." He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "The truth? The truth is irrelevant. What matters is perception, and you've destroyed mine." He stepped closer, lowering his voice into something darker. "Do you understand what happens to people who stand in the way of deals like this? They get erased." Her heart pounded, but she refused to flinch. She saw him clearly now, not the boy she had raised, not the grandson who once chased fireflies in the garden, but a man hollowed out by greed. "You sold me out," she whispered, her voice trembling but sharp. "For money, for strangers," his lips curled. "For progress, for the future. You're clinging to rot, Grandma. Old houses, old streets, old memories. None of it matters. You don't matter." The cruelty in his words cut deeper than any blade. For the first time, she saw the full shape of his betrayal, not just desperation, but a cold calculation that placed her beneath profit. And yet, even as her chest tightened, something inside her hardened. She straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin. "You're wrong, Daniel." Her voice was steady now, carrying the weight of generations. "This house matters. This street matters. And I matter. Because this isn't just property, it's legacy," he sneered. "Legacy doesn't pay bills. Legacy," she countered, her voice rising, "is what gives bills their meaning. Legacy is what built you, what raised you, what gave you everything you've squandered, and you will not take it from me." For the first time, Daniel faltered. Not because her words softened him, but because he hadn't expected resistance. He had imagined her crumbling, begging. Instead, he found steel. Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "This house is not for sale. Not to you, not to your friends, not to anyone." The silence that followed was sharp, brittle. Daniel's eyes narrowed, the mask slipping completely. For a heartbeat, Eleanor thought he might strike her, but instead, he leaned in close, his whisper a venomous hiss. "You just signed your own death sentence." Then he turned, storming out, the door slamming so hard the glass rattled in its frame. Eleanor's knees trembled, her breath shallow. She clutched the edge of the table to steady herself. Pause. But she did not collapse. Not this time. She stood taller. She had spoken the words out loud. "This house is not for sale." And now, there was no turning back. The retaliation came swiftly. 2 nights later, as rain lashed against the windows, Eleanor sat in her living room, the lamp casting a soft glow over Robert's photograph. She was exhausted, her body aching from the weight of the fight, but her spirit held. Then crash. The sound exploded through the night. Glass shattered across the floor, shards scattering like diamonds under the lamplight. She screamed, stumbling back as a brick rolled to a stop at her feet. On it, scrawled in thick black marker, were the words, "Sell or suffer." Her breath came ragged, her chest tight with fear. She staggered toward the window, the rain blowing in through the jagged hole. Out on the street, shadows moved, 2 figures retreating into the darkness, laughter trailing behind them. Her hands shook violently. She dropped to her knees, clutching the brick, tears spilling down her cheeks. Fear. They wanted to break her, to terrify her, to remind her she was alone. But as the rain soaked her carpet, another voice stirred inside her, the voice of Robert, the voice of Marcus, the voice of her neighbors who had begun to believe. No, she wasn't alone. Not anymore. She rose slowly, blood running from a cut on her palm where glass had sliced her skin. She wrapped the wound with a towel, her breath steadying. The pain grounded her. The fear burned into determination. They thought shattered glass would silence her. They didn't understand. Every crack only made her sharper. By dawn, the rain had stopped. Eleanor stood in front of the broken window, sunlight spilling across the shards like fire. Her reflection looked back at her in 1,000 fractured pieces, fragile, broken, but still standing. Her hands trembled, her body weak, but her eyes blazed. She whispered into the empty room, "You will not win. Not here. Not with me." She pressed her palm against Robert's photograph, her blood-stained bandage leaving a faint mark on the glass. Then she picked up the notebook, slipped it into her bag, and stepped toward the door. The fight was no longer confined to her living room. The battle had spilled into the streets, into the courts, into the very heart of Savannah. Eleanor White, widow, grandmother, forgotten woman, was ready to go further than she ever had before. Her body trembled, but her spirit did not. The war had only just begun. The morning air in Savannah was damp, thick with the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Eleanor walked slowly down Broughton Street, her notebook tucked under her arm, the recording still safe inside her phone. Every step felt heavier than the last, but her resolve carried her forward. Her first stop was the Wilkins house. Harold and Marjorie had lived there nearly as long as she had. Their front porch sagged under the weight of years, but it was familiar, her own memories tied into their laughter, their Christmas lights, their grandkids playing hopscotch on the sidewalk. Marjorie opened the door, eyes narrowing in surprise. "Eleanor? You should be resting." Eleanor shook her head. "I can't rest. Not when I know what they're planning." Inside, over coffee gone cold, Eleanor laid it out. Daniel's betrayal, the false transfer of her house, the developers circling like vultures. Her voice cracked as she replayed the recording, Daniel's words filling the kitchen like poison. "She's fragile. She'll crack." The Wilkins exchanged uneasy glances. Harold scratched his chin. "That's ugly, Eleanor, no doubt. But these companies, they've got lawyers, money, influence. What can we do against them?" Marjorie's voice trembled. "And Daniel's your own blood. Maybe there's been some mistake." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "No mistake. He sold me out. And if we do nothing, they'll take all of us." Her words hung heavy in the room. But still, doubt lingered in their eyes. She moved on to the Carters, the Johnsons, the Rodriguezes. She repeated the story until her throat burned. Some listened in silence, some shook their heads, some told her gently to let it go. By the time she stepped back into the humid air, Eleanor felt the weight of their disbelief pressing hard against her chest. Sigh. She had come seeking allies and found only fear. For the first time, her fire wavered. Maybe she was alone. That evening, Marcus arrived at her house. He carried a briefcase full of documents, his expression grim but resolute. "They doubt me," Eleanor admitted, her voice low. "They think I'm just an old woman who's lost her mind." Marcus placed the briefcase on the table, snapping it open. "Then let's show them the truth." He spread out copies of the will, the fraudulent deeds, the bank transfers, each page a weapon sharper than any blade. "You're not crazy, Eleanor. You're right, and they need to see it with their own eyes." The next night, they gathered in the old church basement. Dozens of neighbors filled the wooden pews, their whispers buzzing like restless bees. Eleanor stood at the front, her heart pounding, Marcus at her side. He cleared his throat, voice carrying through the echoing room. "What you're about to see is not rumor. It's not exaggeration. It's fact." He held up the forged deed. "This document claims Eleanor's home belongs to her grandson, but here," he lifted the original will, "is Robert White's true testament. This house, this fund, belongs to Eleanor. Daniel and his associates forged this to strip her of everything." Gasps rippled through the crowd, faces hardened, doubt began to crack. "And it doesn't stop with her," Marcus continued, his voice rising. "These developers are targeting all of you, your houses, your businesses, your history. They're buying your city out from under you." The room grew tense, anger igniting like dry tinder. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "They think we're weak. They think we'll give in quietly. But we have something they don't, each other." The murmur grew louder, agreement sparking where before there had been silence. The tide was shifting. It began with a handful of college students sitting in the back, young faces hardened with indignation. One stood up, a girl with bright eyes and a voice that carried. "My grandmother lost her house last year to these people. They pressured her until she signed. If you're fighting them, I want in." Another rose. "Me too. I study law at the university. I can help organize petitions, research codes, challenge them legally." One by one, hands went up. Students, young professionals, even teenagers, all stepping forward. The energy in the room shifted, no longer heavy with fear but sparking with determination. By the time the meeting ended, a small army had formed. They gathered around Eleanor, notebooks open, ideas spilling out, social media campaigns, rallies, neighborhood watch groups. They spoke of flyers, press conferences, legal aid clinics. Eleanor listened, her eyes wide. For so long she had carried the weight alone. Now she watched it being lifted, shared among dozens of eager hands. One boy, no older than 17, pressed a flyer mock-up into her palm. It read, "Save Savannah. Protect our history." Her heart swelled. Tears. That night, Eleanor walked home under the glow of street lamps, her steps lighter than they had been in months. She paused at the corner, looking at the old buildings, the porches sagging with time, the oaks heavy with moss. They were no longer symbols of loss. They were battlegrounds worth fighting for. Inside her house, she set the flyer on the mantel beside Robert's photograph. His eyes, caught forever in that frozen smile, seemed to look back at her with approval. Eleanor straightened her shoulders. She was no longer just a widow clinging to memories. She was part of something larger. For the first time in a long time, her eyes shone not with grief, but with hope. The fight ahead would be brutal, but she was no longer alone. The community had awakened, and Eleanor White, 72 years old, had found her allies. The air in Savannah had shifted. Eleanor could feel it the moment she returned, heavier, darker, as though the city itself knew something was being stolen piece by piece. She walked the narrow cobblestone streets, notebook hidden in her purse, eyes searching every corner. What she saw broke her heart. Signs appeared on doorways. For sale. Pending development. Flyers stapled to telephone poles announced glossy visions of the future renderings of glass towers, parking garages, and chain stores. They hung like funeral notices over streets that once breathed history. She passed the Carter family home, its shutters closed, its porch empty. They had lived there 3 generations, hosting block parties every summer. Now, a sold sign leaned against the gate. Across the street, the Johnson's bakery sat shuttered, a fresh notice taped to the window, property acquired by Southern Horizons Development. Eleanor stopped, the paper crinkling beneath her trembling fingers. The words were cold, clinical, final. She lifted her gaze and saw a cluster of neighbors huddled on the corner, old men, with caps pulled low, women with arms crossed, their faces etched with worry. A young mother clutched her child, speaking in hushed tones about rent hikes and eviction notices. Eleanor stepped closer, listening. "They're buying up everything," one man muttered. "Whole block's gonna be gone by Christmas." "They offered me half of what my house is worth," another woman said, anger in her voice. "Told me if I didn't take it now, the city would force me out later." "They'll do the same to all of us," a third replied bitterly. The words cut through Eleanor like a blade. She realized her own betrayal wasn't isolated, it was part of a larger machine devouring her city. She pressed a hand against the brick wall beside her, steadying herself. The shadows weren't just circling her house, they were circling everyone. That night, she followed Daniel. She didn't plan it, not at first, but something in her gut told her he wasn't spending his evenings grieving or managing her health insurance. She saw him leave the house in his sleek black car, his expression cold, jaw set. She hailed a cab, her voice steady but low. "Follow that car." They trailed him across the city to a luxury hotel downtown, neon lights glowing against mirrored glass. She watched from the shadows as he stepped out, straightening his tie, and disappeared into the lobby. Eleanor's pulse hammered. She slipped inside quietly, keeping her distance, her heart pounding with every step. The bar was dim, lined with leather booths. Daniel was there, seated with 2 men in sharp suits, their posture radiating wealth and menace. A woman joined them, her red nails tapping against a thick contract folder. Eleanor ducked behind a pillar, straining to hear. "She's still holding out," Daniel said, his voice low but clear. "The house is technically transferred, but she's resisting. You know how stubborn old people can be." The man across from him smirked. "She's sentimental. They all are. But once we have her property, the rest of Broughton Street falls like dominoes." Daniel leaned forward, his voice harder now. "I told you, she's fragile. She'll crack. She doesn't have the fight in her." The words stabbed her. Fragile. She'll crack. To them, she wasn't a grandmother, or a widow, or a woman carrying the weight of history. She was just an obstacle, a wall to be pushed down. Her stomach turned, fury rising like fire in her chest. Her hands shook. but she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. With trembling fingers, she tapped the record button. The screen glowed faintly as she held it close, hidden beneath the folds of her coat. Daniel's voice carried clearly through the room. "Once she's gone, the rest is easy. The investors are waiting. Savannah's old quarter will be unrecognizable in 5 years, and I'll be the one who made it happen." The woman laughed, sliding the contract across the table. "Sign, and we'll release the first payment. You've done well. Family ties are always the hardest to sever." Eleanor gritted her teeth, bile rising in her throat. She forced herself to stay still, to keep recording. Every word was proof. Every word was a dagger sharpened against them. Her heart pounded so loud she feared they would hear it. But they didn't sing. They laughed, clinked glasses, toasted to the destruction of her world. She slipped out quietly, her phone still recording, her hands icy with adrenaline. Out on the street, she gasped for air, her body shaking uncontrollably. Shudder. For the first time, she wasn't just a victim. She was a witness. She was the one holding the truth. Back in her empty house, Eleanor sat in the darkness, her phone playing back the recording. Daniel's voice filled the silence. "She'll crack. She doesn't have the fight in her." She closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks. They thought she was weak. They thought she was already defeated. But as she listened again, something ignited deep inside her. The grief hardened into steel. She realized now this battle wasn't about one house, one will, or even one legacy. It was about all of them. Her neighbors, her friends, the history etched into every brick of Savannah's streets. This wasn't only her fight, it was theirs. She whispered into the dark. "You're wrong, Daniel. I do have the fight in me." The lamp flickered once, the shadows stretching long across the room, and Eleanor White, 72 years old, sat straighter than she had in years, her heart no longer trembling but burning. The war for Savannah had begun. The next morning came draped in fog. Atlanta's skyline blurred, the streets wet with last night's rain. Eleanor held the notebook against her chest like it was armor, following Marcus through a narrow hallway that smelled of old paper and dust. They descended a flight of creaking stairs into the archives, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Marcus led her to a locked cabinet, pulling a key from his pocket. His hands shook slightly, not from age, but from the weight of what he was about to reveal. He turned the lock, pulled open the drawer, and retrieved a thick folder stamped with Robert's name. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. Eleanor's throat tightened. She nodded. Marcus opened the file and spread the pages carefully across the oak table. The paper smelled faintly of ink and time. At the top, in Robert's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "Last Will and Testament." Eleanor leaned closer, her eyes scanning the lines, her breath faltering as the truth unfolded. "To my beloved wife, Eleanor White, I leave the house at 214 Broughton Street, all its furnishings, and the remainder of my estate, to be used in the establishment of the Eleanor White Scholarship Fund for underprivileged students of history. To my grandson, Daniel Reed White, I leave a monthly stipend sufficient for his living expenses, contingent upon his respect and care for my wife following my death." Her hands began to tremble. She pressed her palm flat against the table to steady herself. It was there, clear, undeniable. The house, the assets, the $15 million all secured in her name, to honor her, to carry her legacy forward. Daniel was never meant to inherit it all. He was meant to be cared for, but not indulged. Robert had known. He had seen the danger. He had built protections. Tears filled her eyes. For weeks she had believed she was powerless, that she had been foolish, duped by her own blood. And now the truth was sharper, heavier, devastating in its clarity. She whispered into the silence, "Robert, you knew." Marcus placed a steady hand on hers. "He trusted you. He trusted that you'd carry this forward." The weight of it broke her. Her chest shook with sobs, each one dragging up years of silence she had carried through her marriage. She had spent decades in Robert's shadow, quiet, obedient, convinced she was just the keeper of his world. Now, here was proof that he had seen her strength all along. He had written her name into history itself. She pressed her face into her hands. Sobs. "I thought I'd lost everything. I thought Daniel had taken it all. I thought I was nothing." Marcus's voice was low but firm. "You are not nothing. You were never nothing. Robert left this to you because he knew who you are, and because he knew who Daniel might become." Eleanor looked up, her eyes red but blazing with a new fire. The grief inside her was real, but so was the resolve rising from its ashes. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't a victim. She was the keeper of something larger than herself, an inheritance of purpose, a legacy meant to protect not just her, but generations to come. For the first time, she felt her back straighten, her breath steady. The fear that had clouded her since the night Daniel slid those papers across the table began to lift. She had been wrong about herself, but Robert hadn't been. Marcus shuffled the papers into order, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowing. "Eleanor, this wasn't just Daniel. He doesn't have the power or the knowledge to forge these documents on his own." She frowned. "What do you mean?" He tapped the edge of the file. These forgeries were sophisticated, too precise for a single desperate young man. There are lawyers, notaries, state databases, all of which would have had to be compromised. That kind of operation requires resources, influence, money. Her stomach turned. "So, who's behind him?" Marcus sighed heavily, leaning back. "Developers. I've heard whispers for months. A real estate consortium out of Atlanta has been circling Savannah's historic district. They've been buying properties through shell companies, squeezing residents out, demolishing heritage for profit. Robert suspected it. That's why he came to me. That's why he insisted on this clause." Eleanor's breath caught. "Are you saying Daniel is working with them?" "I'm saying," Marcus replied grimly, "he is their pawn. They want your house. They want your block. They want all of Broughton Street. And Daniel, he's the one who opened the door." Her hands clenched into fists. Images flashed through her mind. Neighbors who had lived in those homes for decades, families who gathered on porches in the evenings, children who played under the oak trees draped in Spanish moss. The life of Savannah itself. It wasn't just about her anymore. The realization hit her like a blow. She wasn't simply fighting for her home, or for Robert's legacy, or even for herself. She was standing at the edge of a battle that stretched across her entire community. Her voice broke as she whispered, "If they take this house, they'll take everything. Everyone." Marcus nodded gravely. "This isn't just your inheritance, Eleanor. It's your city's soul." She sat in the dim light of the archive room, her fingers still resting on Robert's will, her heart pounding with fear and fury. The betrayal of her grandson had been enough to nearly break her. But this was larger, darker, more dangerous. For the first time in her 72 years, Eleanor White felt the full weight of the fight before her, and though her hands trembled, her resolve burned steady. The battle was no longer personal. It was communal, and she knew deep in her bones that she could not, and would not, walk away. The house was heavy with silence that morning, the kind of silence that feels alive, pressing against your chest, waiting for you to break it. Eleanor moved slowly through Robert's study, the air still carrying his presence, the faint musk of his cologne, the dust of chalk from decades of lecturing, the quiet hum of a man who had once filled every corner with purpose. She opened drawers with trembling hands, searching for anything that could explain what had been done. Papers rustled, receipts folded neatly into envelopes, lesson plans annotated in Robert's careful script. She dug deeper, past tax returns and yellowing lecture notes, until her fingers touched the edge of something different. Leather, worn, soft from use. It was a notebook. She pulled it out carefully, her breath catching in her throat. Robert's handwriting danced across the first page, looping and deliberate. At first, she thought it was another one of his research journals, lists of historical references, quotes from Cicero or Thucydides, the kind of notes he always carried to his lectures. But as she turned the pages, her eyes froze. There, written in bold strokes, was a single word. Will. Her pulse quickened. She flipped again. More notes, dates, phone numbers, and then a name she had not heard in decades, Marcus Lee, attorney at law, Atlanta. Next to it, a reminder in Robert's tidy hand. Updated documents, confidential. She pressed her hand over her mouth. Robert had known. He had prepared something Somewhere in those pages lay the map to a truth Daniel hadn't counted on her finding. She sat down heavily in Robert's chair, clutching the notebook like a lifeline. Each page felt like Robert whispering across the void. Don't let them take what matters. Don't let them twist it. The fear inside her shifted. For the first time in weeks, her spine straightened. She had a lead. By the next morning, her decision was made. Eleanor packed a small bag, nothing more than a change of clothes, the notebook, and the fading photograph of Robert she kept beside her bed. She locked the front door of the house with deliberate care, the key cool in her palm. For 50 years, this home had been her world. Now it was just another place someone was trying to steal from her. At the bus station, she stood out. Among students clutching backpacks and workers with earbuds, there she was, an old woman in a dark coat, clutching a leather notebook to her chest. Some looked at her with faint pity, as though she were out of place. But her eyes burned with something fiercer than pity could touch. The bus to Atlanta groaned to life. Eleanor climbed aboard, gripping the rail as the driver nodded. She chose a seat by the window, lowering herself slowly, her knees aching with the years. Outside, Savannah slipped away Spanish moss and iron balconies fading into highways and forests. Every mile carried her further from the world she had known, but closer to the truth she needed. She thought of Daniel, of his rehearsed smile, of the moment he had said, "It's done," like a sentence carved in stone. And she thought of Robert, his voice, his steady presence, the way he used to squeeze her hand when the world felt uncertain. Her grip on the notebook tightened. "I won't let you down," she whispered into the hum of the engine. The bus rocked on. Rain began to fall against the glass, streaking the window like tears she refused to shed. She wasn't running away. She was heading toward something, toward a man named Marcus, toward the truth buried in her husband's last words. For the first time since Robert's death, Eleanor felt purpose like blood in her veins. Atlanta was louder, harder, sharper than Savannah. The bus hissed to a stop, and Eleanor stepped down into the rush of traffic and neon signs. She asked for directions twice, clutching the notebook, until she found the building and office tower that looked far too modern for the name she carried in her hands. The plaque by the elevator read, "Marcus Lee, Attorney at Law." Her heart pounded as she climbed the final stairs. She pushed open the glass door, the bell chiming softly. Behind the desk, a man in his 70s looked up. His hair was silver, his suit sharp but worn in a way that suggested history. His dark eyes widened, and for a moment time seemed to fold. "Eleanor?" he said, disbelief threading his voice. Her throat closed. "Marcus, it's been a long time." He came around the desk, took her frail hands in his, shaking his head in astonishment. "Robert's Eleanor. My God, when I heard about his passing." His words faltered. "I'm so sorry." She nodded, unable to speak. The grief swelled, but she forced it down. There was no time for tears. "I found this," she whispered, holding out the notebook. "Your name was in it. He trusted you." Marcus opened the notebook, scanning Robert's handwriting. The shift in his face was immediate confusion, then realization, then alarm. He looked up sharply. "What happened, Eleanor?" Her voice cracked as she told him. "Daniel, the papers, the transfers, the house, the fund." Every word tasted like betrayal on her tongue. When she finished, Marcus lowered the notebook, his hands trembling. No, that's impossible. Robert updated everything. I handled it myself. He left protections for you. He made it clear." Eleanor leaned forward, her voice fierce through her exhaustion. "Then why is my name gone? Why does my grandson own everything?" Marcus exhaled slowly, the weight of the truth settling on him. "Because someone forged it. Someone manipulated the system. And if it's Daniel, then he's not alone." Her chest tightened. "What do you mean?" He glanced at the door, then back at her. His voice dropped. "Robert suspected your grandson might be influenced. He worried about people circling the estate developers, investors. That's why he wrote my name. That's why he made sure I had the originals." Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap. "Do you still have them?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, but they're not here." The office felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing in. Marcus closed the notebook and placed his hand over hers. Come back tomorrow morning. I'll take you to the archives. You'll see for yourself. The will, the trust, everything your husband wanted for you. Her body sagged with relief and fear all at once. Tomorrow. She only had to make it through tonight. As she left the office, stepping back into the sharp Atlanta air, she didn't notice the figure across the street. A man leaning casually against a lamppost, cigarette glowing between his fingers, eyes tracking her every step. He flicked the ash to the pavement, pulled out his phone, and whispered into the receiver. She found Marcus! The ember flared once more in the darkness, before vanishing. And Eleanor, clutching the notebook to her chest, walked unknowingly into the next shadow of betrayal. The first sign came quietly, like a whisper slipping through the cracks of an old house, a number on a bank statement, a transaction that didn't make sense. Eleanor wasn't looking for it. She hadn't touched those accounts in years. Robert had handled all of that, with his tidy folders, his meticulous notes. She had always trusted him, trusted the order he left behind. But there it was, a withdrawal of $12,000, another of $7,500, both marked as transfer to secondary account, both dated days after Robert's funeral. Eleanor sat at the mahogany desk in the study, her reading glasses sliding down her nose, the lamplight trembling against her wrinkled hands. She blinked, adjusted the papers, read again. No mistake. These weren't normal. Her chest tightened. A thought surfaced, uninvited. Those papers Daniel gave me, she tried to push it aside. He had said it was health insurance, protective measures. Don't worry about the details, Grandma. I'll take care of you. The words had sounded so tender at the time. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But the numbers before her told another story. Her pulse began to quicken. She flipped through more pages, receipts, automatic drafts. Another payment, this time a processing fee for $2,000 to an entity she didn't recognize. Then another, larger, $25,000 sent to an investment firm in New York she had never heard of. It didn't feel right. None of it. She leaned back in Robert's old leather chair, the smell of tobacco and time still lingering in its seams, and whispered into the empty room, "What have you done, Daniel?" By the next afternoon, her unease had swelled into a storm. She found Daniel in the kitchen, his jacket still on, phone in hand, scrolling, always scrolling. "Daniel," she began, steady but sharp. "I've been looking through some of the bank records. There are transfers I don't understand." His head jerked up, his smile quick and rehearsed. "Oh, Grandma, you don't have to worry about that. It's just me moving some funds around to keep everything safe." "Safe?" She pressed, the word sticking to her tongue like something sour. $12,000. $7,500. Do you call that safe? He chuckled lightly, dismissively, as though her concern was amusing. "It's just logistics. You know how complicated estates can be after someone passes? The lawyers, the taxes, the banks, they all want their piece. I'm just making sure you don't get buried under paperwork." But his eyes didn't meet hers. They darted, restless, slipping back to the glowing screen in his hand. Eleanor felt her breath hitch. "Daniel, I need you to explain this properly. I don't understand these transfers." He put his phone down, finally, and reached across the counter to pat her hand. The gesture felt rehearsed, a performance. "Grandma," he said softly, "you've been through so much. Losing Grandpa, I don't want you stressing over things like this. Just trust me. I'll handle it." The words should have comforted her. Instead, they scraped across her nerves. Pause. For the first time, she heard the hollow echo inside them. Days passed. Each time she tried to bring it up, he brushed her off. He always had a reason, always had a smile, always had an excuse, until the letter arrived. It was a Tuesday morning, the sun slicing through lace curtains, when she found the envelope slipped beneath her door. No return address, just her name in blocky letters. She tore it open with trembling fingers. Inside was a copy of a deed, her house deed, but the name printed under owner was not hers. Her heart stuttered. It said, Daniel Reed White. She stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the table. The room tilted. The air seemed thinner, sharper. She read again, desperate for a mistake. But no, the language was cold, clear, merciless. The property at 214 Broughton Street had been transferred. her home, her sanctuary, the place where she had lived with Robert, where her daughter had laughed, where Daniel himself had toddled down the hallway clutching her hand, now no longer hers. And there was more. Attached to the deed was a notice from an investment trust. The entire research fund, $15 million Robert had spent years cultivating, was listed under new management, managed by Daniel. Her vision blurred. The pen she had held that night, the stack of papers Daniel had slid toward her with his practiced smile. It hadn't been insurance. It hadn't been protection. It had been theft. A sob tore from her chest before she could stop it. Grief. She clutched the paper to her chest as if squeezing it might change the words. Robert had trusted her. He had trusted her to protect what he left behind, and she foolishly, blindly, had given it away with a signature. That evening, the house was darker than it had ever felt. Every shadow pressed closer. Every creak of the floor whispered betrayal. Eleanor sat at the dining table, the deed spread before her, the notice of transfer beside it, her face lit only by the weak glow of a single lamp. Daniel came in late, the smell of cologne and whiskey trailing him. "You're still awake?" he asked, loosening his tie, glancing at the papers as though they were nothing more than junk mail. Her voice cracked as she held them up. "What is this, Daniel?" His smile faltered just slightly, then returned. "Oh, Grandma, don't worry. It's just a formality. It makes things easier for the banks, for taxes, for everyone." Her hand slammed the table, the sound echoing through the hollow house. "Don't lie to me!" The words hung in the air, heavier than any she had ever spoken to him. But Daniel didn't flinch. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed. And for the first time, Eleanor saw him not as her grandson, not as the boy she had promised to protect, but as a man who had already chosen his path. "You signed it," he said quietly, almost cruelly. "It's done." She felt her body shake, her breath shallow. "This is my home, your grandfather's work, our life." "It's just a house, Grandma," he replied, his voice colder now. "And money doesn't mean anything sitting in dusty accounts. I know what to do with it. I can make it grow. I can build something bigger than this old place." The old place. Those words stabbed. This house had been her life. The walls carried laughter, tears, whispered dreams. Bigger than this old place? To him, it was nothing more than collateral. Her eyes filled with tears. "You promised to take care of me." He didn't answer. He just walked away, his phone buzzing in his hand, his figure swallowed by the shadows of the hallway. When the house grew silent again, Eleanor sank into the chair, her hands shaking around the edges of a framed photograph. Robert, smiling in his tweed jacket, standing before the lecture hall, chalk dust clinging to his sleeves. A man of words, of history, of integrity, a man who had trusted her to keep his legacy safe. Tears streaked down her cheeks, falling onto the glass. "I'm sorry, Robert. I didn't see it. I didn't know." But as the night deepened, something inside her shifted. Grief sharpened into resolve. She wiped her face, set the photo gently back on the mantel, and whispered into the dark, "I will find the truth. I will not let him destroy what you built." The crack in her trust had widened into a wound, but in that wound, something fierce had begun to grow. And Eleanor White, widow, grandmother, forgotten woman, was about to step into a battle that would decide not only her future, but the future of everything Robert had left behind. The city of Savannah has always worn its history like a veil. Cobblestone streets winding between moss-draped oaks, iron balconies clinging to old brick facades. The ghosts of another century whispering through the warm, heavy air, and in the very heart of this southern tapestry stood a house that had belonged to Eleanor White for nearly 5 decades. It was a house that had witnessed triumph, laughter, bitter arguments, reconciliations, and long silences. It had been her fortress and her prison, all at once. Now, at 72 years old, she stood alone in that house, a widow, a shadow of who she once was. Robert White, her husband of 50 years, had been laid to rest just 2 weeks earlier. A man who had taught history at the university, admired by his students, praised by colleagues, respected for his quiet brilliance. a man who lectured about civilizations lost, empires risen and fallen, and yet in his own home had built an empire of routine. Eleanor had been his loyal partner, the silent half of his legacy. She had baked bread for every student gathering, ironed his shirts before every lecture, and carried the burden of his reputation on her shoulders without complaint. Now the lectures had ended. The classroom was empty, and Eleanor found herself staring at the hollow silence of their Savannah home. The funeral had drained her. Faces she barely knew had shaken her hands, told her how lucky she had been to love such a man. A scholar, they said, a gentleman, a gift to this town. They didn't see the trembling in her hands as she poured coffee for them afterward. They didn't see how she slipped into the master bedroom that night and pressed her face against his pillow, desperate to hold on to a scent that was already fading. The house was too big now, the silence too loud. Every step on the hardwood floors echoed with ghosts. She would wander into the study and trace her fingers along the spines of Robert's books, whispering their titles aloud as if speaking his name in another language. She lingered by the window where he used to sit with his tea, staring out at the garden like he was still lecturing invisible students. Eleanor was not fragile, she never had been, but grief makes even the strongest bones brittle. Pause. She felt it in her chest, in her breath, a hollowness. By day, she moved like a guest in her own house. By night, she curled into the corner of her bed, clutching photographs that refused to warm her hands. It was in these nights of unbearable silence that memories attacked her. She remembered Robert at 40, lecturing in his booming voice, oblivious to her exhaustion as she juggled 2 jobs to pay for Daniel's schooling. She remembered their daughter gone too soon, buried before she even reached her 30th birthday. That loss had carved a wound that never healed. Daniel had been the only light left, her daughter's boy, her grandson, her last fragile link to family. She remembered birthdays in this house, Daniel's small hands tearing wrapping paper while she baked his favorite chocolate cake. She remembered his laughter ringing down the hallway. She remembered promising her daughter on her deathbed, "I'll take care of him. He will always have me." But time had a cruel way of changing people. Daniel had grown distant, absorbed into his own life, a career in finance that Eleanor barely understood. He rarely visited, and when he did, his phone was always in his hand, his eyes always darting towards something more important. Yet in the quiet after Robert's funeral, when the world felt colder than she could bear, Daniel appeared at her doorstep. The sound of his knock startled her. She opened the heavy oak door to find him standing there in a crisp suit, holding a bouquet of lilies, the same flowers she had placed on Robert's grave. His smile was warm, too warm, the kind of smile that looked rehearsed. "Grandma," he said softly, stepping forward to embrace her. For a moment, she let herself collapse into his arms, drinking in the comfort. She had forgotten how it felt to be held by family. "You shouldn't be alone," he whispered, pulling back just enough to look into her tired eyes. "Not now." He came inside, set the flowers on the dining table where Robert's books still sat untouched, and spoke with a gentleness that made her chest ache. He asked how she was eating, if she was sleeping, if the nights were too long. He reached for her hand across the table. For the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt seen. She wanted to believe this was love. She wanted to believe her grandson had returned, not out of duty, but out of genuine care. His words washed over her like warm water. "You've always taken care of everyone, Grandma. Now it's my turn to take care of you." Her heart softened. For a flicker of a moment, she believed she wasn't alone. And then the papers appeared. Daniel reached into his leather briefcase. He slid a neat stack of documents across the table, his tone as smooth as honey. "These are just some health insurance forms," he said casually. "Standard stuff. You know how complicated medical care can be, especially at your age. We just need to make sure everything is in order." Eleanor stared at the papers, lines of text blurred before her eyes. She saw words like assignment of property, primary beneficiary, transfer of assets. The air in the room shifted, thick and suffocating. Daniel's voice cut through the haze. "Don't worry about the details, Grandma. It's just paperwork. Just sign here and here and here." Her hand trembled as she picked up the pen. She felt the weight of his gaze pressing down on her. The grandson she had raised, The boy she had promised to protect was now coaxing her into something she couldn't quite understand. The camera of memory froze. At that moment, her wrinkled hand hovering above the signature line, the pen glistening under the light, Daniel's reassuring smile shadowed by calculation. The house held its breath. Eleanor's eyes lifted from the page and searched his face. Somewhere in that smile, she caught the faint glimmer of something cold, something that did not belong to the boy she once knew. And there, in that suspended silence, the seeds of betrayal were planted. The segment continues with layered narration, inner conflict, sensory details, pauses for weight, and Eleanor's emotional descent, expanding her hesitation, the storm of memories colliding with suspicion, and the ominous tone of Daniel's presence. The full version stretches across detailed imagery and Eleanor's psychological unraveling, weaving tension into every beat until the clock strikes the 7-minute mark with her hand still hovering, caught between love and dread.